today. Sorry.
Hello and welcome to SnarkSquad Pod, a media podcast full of friendship, feelings, and snark. My name is Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines.
And today we are joined by Clarabelle Ortega.
Hello, I am Clarabelle. I'm the author of Ghost Squad, which is coming April 7th, 2020 from Scholastic. And I am also the co-host of the Write or Die podcast.
We invited Clarabelle today to talk to us about Hustlers. And I have the honor of trying to explain what the plot of this movie is. So I guess we're going to start way in the past of 2007. And we're introduced to a woman named Dorothy who works as a stripper, and her stage name is Destiny. And I promise you, I'm going to just flip-flop between those two names, whatever comes out. But they are the same person. Indeed, Dorothy and Destiny are the same person. Dorothy is working as a stripper, and she's trying to support her grandmother, but she's kind of barely getting by at the strip club until one night she watches the most popular stripper, J-Lo, and she's like super impressed. As J-Lo performs and earns lots of dollars, lots of money, and Destiny decides to approach J-Lo, whose name is Ramona, and I will try to use that name. And in the most iconic scene of the movie, Ramona invites Dorothy to sit in her fur coat. And then Ramona also metaphorically takes Destiny under her wing, showing her how to spot the different kinds of clients, including the CEOs, bankers, and hedge fund managers, which is who they want to kind of lure. And the two of them team up and make lots of money together, but eventually drift apart. 1 year later, in the dark days of 2008, the financial crisis hits and no one is making money. Destiny's boyfriend leaves her, and I think in this time she also has a baby. I watched this movie last week, so the details are fuzzy, but she has a baby, and she has nowhere to turn, so she has to go back to stripping. But because work is light, the strip club is now mostly a front for a prostitution thing. But when she's there, she reconnects with Ramona, and Ramona's like, hey, I got this new gig going on, and basically she's going out and along with two other girls, Mercedes and Annabelle, they're going out and trying to lure men to the strip club, getting them super drunk and running up their credit cards, but also they're drugging men. So they're using ketamine and ecstasy in a combination. And it has the bonus of memory loss. So these men wake up the next day with no money and no memory. And none of these men who have been robbed want to admit that they were at the strip club and that's where they lost all the money. So business is super lucrative again. And nobody has learned how to save money either. And, the second time around, they're all getting rich. And I feel that though, I am also very bad at saving money. Things start to turn sour when Ramona decides to cut ties with the strip club so that she doesn't have to share profits. And she starts recruiting other people into their little, ring or whatever, but she's recruiting strippers with drug problems. And Dorothy is like, maybe this is a bad idea. And this proves correct. One night that one of the drug guys bust his head open and Dorothy has to rush him to the hospital, and Ramona is nowhere to be found because she's bailing the new girl, Dawn, out of jail. When Dorothy finally gets home, she finds that her grandmother has passed away, and Dorothy and Ramona end up making up at the funeral, but things remain weird between them as Ramona continues to make questionable decisions. The new girl with the drug problem, Dawn, gets picked up by the police and rats Ramona and the gang out. With Dawn's help, the police get the testimony of more men and identify and arrest all of the girls involved. Dorothy is the only one who takes a plea deal, mostly because of the kid she had at some point in this movie. Ramona somehow manages to avoid jail time, even though Mercedes and Annabelle don't. The whole story has been framed this whole time by an interview happening in 2014. Dorothy is talking to Julia Stiles, who is writing an article about Ramona. Julia also talks to Ramona, who is now working in retail, and during that conversation, Ramona says that Dorothy is the only person who she always had her back, and she still carries around a little picture of Dorothy amongst her prized possessions. After the article is published, Dorothy calls Julia Stiles again to ask more questions about what Ramona said and how she is, and Julia's like, girl, call her. The end.
Yes, so that is what happened in this movie. We are going to start where we always start. Did you like this movie, Clarabelle?
I did. I liked it. I definitely had problems with it, but I liked it.
Same. I liked it. I had fun watching it, I guess, is like the better thing to say. I went with a group of girls and we all like enjoyed ourselves and giggled throughout. As I mentioned, I watched it a week ago now, and the fact that like my memory's kind of fuzzy on some of the details, despite that plot that I had to like put together. I think that says something about it. But in general, I feel like I got what I paid for.
I really loved this. So I saw this by myself and I'm like, I want to go back and see it with my friends. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, but I was like, oh man, I gotta, get a group of friends together and go back and see it. So I'm very curious to hear some of the highs and lows of this experience for all of you. So it's worth mentioning up at the top that this movie is adapted from a piece in The Cut in 2015. Fairly faithfully adapted too. I think the biggest change that they made is that they somewhat softened Constance Wu's character, which I think makes sense because she's our main point of entry into this world. But I guess we should start with her. How did you feel about Dorothy/Destiny?
I didn't love her. And I'm going to tell you why. So at first I did. I thought that, she was like a sympathetic character, whatever. But when she first started talking to Julia Stiles' character, like the reporter, the way that she was talking about Ramona/J-Lo was like, she said a couple things. She said she was always in control, and she said that she'll say anything to make herself sound better. Like she's a liar. She said she's a liar. She'll say anything to make herself sound good. And so I thought going in that it was going to be a situation where it was like Ramona's character had already started doing all this like really shady shit and sort of tricked Dorothy into like going along with it. Like maybe Dorothy didn't know that they were gonna like drug the men or whatever.
Right.
But she was such a big part. Like she came up with so many components of the scheme. She was like, let's make our own fucking formula. She was like, let's hit up our old client base. Like she was by all intents and purposes the freaking brains behind like the details of the operation. And yet, she was making herself sound like an innocent victim during the interview. And I'm like, actually, the person who is saying whatever they need to make themselves sound better is kind of you, not Ramona. Like, Ramona had your back from the very beginning. And then you sold her out for a kid that it didn't really seem like you cared about that much. Like, she was like, oh, yeah, I'm just watching it for my friend, she says about Lily, her baby, like when she's talking to one of the clients. So it's just like, what the hell? So I didn't love her. Like, it was really weird because at first I felt like I was going to root for her, and obviously like she's trying to support it's her grandmother, right? Like she's trying to support her, and like that is obviously like, you feel for her, but I just felt like she was really out for herself. And she really saw herself as a victim when she wasn't in the way that she painted herself out to be. So I didn't love her.
I had similar feelings. Like, I don't know. I didn't feel strongly one way or another. I really like Constance Wu. And I think that there were moments like specifically when she's like rushing the guy who like busted his head open to the emergency room. And she starts screaming like, help him. And then like turns it off and gets in the car and like stomps away. Like there were very quick turns of acting that I really enjoyed watching from her. But the character itself was kind of blah to me, and like it evened out to a place where I didn't have strong feelings one way or the other. There were like that whole thing about her being more invested than she wanted to lead on. And then like at the very beginning when she goes out to introduce herself basically to J-Lo, and she's like kind of like, oh, what if we teamed up? And she's like very clearly looking for something, but playing it in that very like innocent way. And you can tell that Ramona can tell, but she goes along with it anyways. And so there were a lot of ways that I think that they wanted Constance Wu's character to be the sympathetic one, but it didn't always land. And I'm not sure if that was purposeful or not.
Yeah, so I was only going to say that I agree with most of what Clarabelle was saying in terms of, how do I like this character in the sense of like, do I want to hang out with this woman? But like this character in terms of how she functions in this story, I enjoyed, because I think most of that stuff is meant to be read as like she is also super manipulative. All of them are, in order to be able to do this. Like that's inherent to the sort of the grift that they were running, and her unreliability is also something that they kind of tease out a little bit throughout the movie with the narrative device of having her talking to this reporter. And there's a turn late in the movie where Constance Wu turns off the recorder, and then, you know, like there's no sound for the the rest of this scene until the door slams, and then we're getting a perspective shift, and suddenly we're with Julia Stiles. And in fact, right before that, there's a bit where they're talking about basically the guy who first leads to them getting caught. And when his name comes up, when they're talking, all of a sudden his name is getting bleeped out while they're talking, as sort of the setup to this moment where the sound is going to be cut, and we're going to kind of shift focus and follow Julia Stiles for a minute before we kind of jump back into Constance Wu's perspective. I enjoyed what they were doing with this character, and I think, I mean, even the thing like with her kid, I think it's a thing that we see a lot in sort of female stories where they have children, but the story isn't about them having children. We have talked about this a number of times on the podcast, most notably with The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, that like Midge clearly doesn't give a shit about her children, but also we don't want to watch her be a parent. And I think in this particular case, like there wasn't really the time or space.
So bad,
but it's true. Okay, who wants to watch Midge parent? No one. But in this case, like that particular example where she's like, "Oh, I'm just watching for my friend," like she's trying to, she's desperate. She's calling this man because she's desperate, and she does not. She's downplaying, the fact that she has a child, because that is not conducive to what she's trying to get out of this interaction, right? So I don't know, like I don't read that as honest. So yeah, I think there is a lot that is super interesting about this character. Whether or not she's like a good person is separate.
I don't know. There was just something about her calling Lily it instead of her that sort of like struck me, and whether or not she was doing that like for the guy's benefit, I feel like is questionable, because she could have just said her and be like, "Oh, I'm just watching her for my friend." But the fact that she said it was just kind of like, why? That was just like an extra level. But like, you're right, I guess like she could have been like trying to like play off like that it didn't matter, but also she also didn't go to sort of see what was wrong with the kid either. Like she was just sort of sitting there ignoring her. So I don't know, like I just got bad feels from that moment.
I think what's interesting is that for sure Dorothy is supposed to be our entry point into the story, but I think that her function kind of shifts throughout the movie as she makes you feel more or less for Ramona. There are moments where Ramona's interactions with Dorothy, I'm like, Ramona's not that bad. Like, you should put her in her fur coat. And like when they reunited and she was like, "You could have called me," there was so much sincerity there, where at other points I wasn't sure that Ramona was always sincere. And then by the end, you see that she's been carrying around this picture of her forever. But then also like the moments that I felt the least for Ramona was because Dorothy was right. And Dorothy was saying, don't hire, people who are addicts, and don't bring in like a bunch of people into our, ring of drugging guys, because that's probably dangerous. And so Dorothy was right on all of those counts. So it makes you, well, me, because I have a very strong and defined sense of justice, and I wanted a big fat, like, I told you so at one point, and it never happened. But like, it made me feel less for Ramona. So in addition to being like that entry point, I just think that our view of Ramona kind of came through Dorothy.
Yeah, I also feel like she's somewhat of like an unreliable narrator in that way, because like I agree Ramona really messed up with hiring that one, what was her name, Dawn, but also like I can't help but feel like the reason why she hired her was the same reason why she sort of brings in everybody else who's like a lost little duckling, because every time like she messed up, she's like, "Oh, come on, I'll buy you lunch, baby." Like she's just being caring for everybody, and it's almost like she's too nice, like to a fault. She didn't listen to Dorothy, and she totally should have. That was like the dumbest move that she could have done, but I don't think that makes her a bad person. I think that she's still, I mean, she was drugging people and taking their money, but on aside from that, and you know, whether or not that makes her bad is also questionable, because the guys were kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, there's like a Robin Hood thing going on. 100%.
Yeah, but I don't know. I still see sort of like that tenderness behind the things that she did, even when they were really stupid. Whereas I feel like Dorothy was always sort of looking out for herself and nobody else. But yeah, that was just my take.
I do agree with that assessment that like some of the ways in which Dorothy is portraying Ramona were skewed by, you know, the fact that she is talking to this reporter and that there is kind of a sort of questionable reliability to the way that she's communicating for all of those reasons. I don't fully agree that she's entirely looking out for herself. Like, I think part of what I loved about this movie is that in addition to being, you know, grifters and stealing from like these Wall Street douchebags, there is also a like found family
Found
vibe.
family.
Yes. and I think that this for me lands very well as a found family, because I do buy it. I do buy that all of these women care a ton about each other. Maybe there are places where you could have communicated more of that, but I don't know. I buy that they all cared about each other, but I do totally agree that Ramona is painted at the outset as having duplicitous motivations and whatever, but by the end of the movie, I also wound up feeling like everybody that she brought in, she was bringing in as sort of a nurturer. Which I guess segues into, how did you guys feel about Ramona?
I really liked her character. First of all, the fact that J-Lo, who is 50 years old, is playing a stripper, it's amazing. I mean, obviously she looks like incredible, but I just really like that. I like that she was the ringleader and that she is older, and that isn't really mentioned at all. That's not like a sticking point, which is great. It felt like somebody I could know from my neighborhood. And I mean, I did grow up in the Bronx, so that's probably part of it. But she felt very relatable to me in like the really gruff, like women like from the street who like will very easily stab you in the eye, but also like buy you a bacon, egg, and cheese after and just tell you why they did it. I like that aspect of her. I also think that, you know, she was pretty much everybody in this movie. She's like completely irresponsible, doing like the crazy shit ever. She has a kid and she's, I guess, doing it for her kid. I'm not really sure. But I liked her character. I thought she was really cool. And the choice to dance to Fiona Apple, Criminal, in that intro just like really like touched my heart. Like that was just like, this was made for me.
They wanted that music originally and they weren't sure if they could get it. And then J-Lo just like calls Fiona Apple to be like, yo, can we use your song?
The perks of being J-Lo.
Yes.
Right. I liked the character as well. And I think having this conversation has made me realize that probably what I like the most is that we don't get any sort of like concrete answers about the character, about her motivations. Is this like, we don't get like the speech of like, this is for my daughter or anything like that. It just, they present us the character and kind of leave us on this whole thing of like, you should call her at the end of the movie. And the rest is just kind of like open to our interpretation. And I do like that we see like a lot of like highs and lows with the character, and there were moments where I was like, this, what a badass bitch, and then some moments where I'm like, you're crazy. So she was, I think, the character that I enjoyed the most, and that was kind of like the linchpin of the experience for me.
Yes, I firmly agree that she is the thing on which this movie succeeds or fails, probably more so than anybody else. And there are a number of really talented, wonderful women throughout this movie. I think they're all great at what they're being asked to do, but like J-Lo. J-Lo. So I guess it also makes sense while we're talking characters to kind of quickly move through a few of the other characters. So I'm blanking on Keke Palmer's character name, but Keke Palmer and Lily Reinhardt. How did you guys feel about their characters?
I guess of all of them, well, we did get to see like a little bit of like their sort of outside motivations, sort of. I guess with Keke, what was her fiance's name? Dragon. She was like, she was funny also, but like there wasn't like too much going on there for me. I feel like in terms of substance, like it was just sort of like, I'm here and I have a fiance in jail and I'm buying my own engagement ring. And she definitely made me laugh talking about the chicken wings and when she ran away in that one scene and it was just like her butt like, and she's just like running in the parking lot. She's like, bye. And she just leaves. That was great. But I mean, I just feel like she was sort of like a minor like side character, even though she kind of had a lot of screen time. There wasn't any like character arc or like anything to be. I feel like the other girl, the one from Riverdale, I don't know her name either. She had more of a little bit of a story to tell than Keke Palmer's character.
I think the true blessing here has been Keke Palmer doing the press tour.
Yes.
Sorry to this man.
Sorry to this, yeah.
That is it.
She's selling merch, apparently.
Yes.
I think one of my biggest complaints, and I mean, that's kind of harsh. It's not like a huge thing, but part of the reason that I was like, I liked it, but I don't know all the way about it was some of this like superfluous stuff around the outside, which made it really entertaining to watch in the moment, but that also was kind of shallow. And I feel like, Keke Palmer's character, Mercedes and Annabelle, I think are their names, but I don't know which one's which.
Mercedes is Keke Palmer.
Okay. And so they add to like the general found family thing, but as individual characters, there wasn't much there. Like I love Lizzo. I love Cardi B. I don't know why they were in this movie and why they were on posters for this movie. And like that was like absolutely wild to me. So some of like the ways that it felt like very almost fan servicey, like I appreciated it in the moment. Like I was like, look, Lizzo. But then like now reflecting back, I'm like, why was Lizzo in this movie? So that wasn't necessarily Annabelle and Mercedes. They had more to do, but not a ton to do. So I appreciated that they were part of like this larger found family and the Christmas dinner and all of that. But I just don't have many other feelings outside of that.
I do agree that it is wild how much the marketing played up the presence of Cardi B and Lizzo in this movie. I expected them to have a lot more to do, but basically every scene that they are in is in the trailer.
Yes.
Like
correct.
You've seen all of their appearance if you've seen the trailer for this movie. But I like why they were in this movie is because it's fun. Like
right.
I don't and that to me seems like sufficient
Enough.
reason. Yes. I resist the suggestion that it needs to be more than that they need more justification than because it's fun.
I wish Cardi had been in more of the movie. I think she was really funny and like she did a really good job acting. Like Lizzo was okay. Like it was fun to see her, but her acting wasn't there for me yet, which is totally fine because it was almost like a cameo. But I feel like Cardi could have been in the whole thing. Like she was really charming and like all her scenes, she was hilarious and she has the chops. Like she has been in this industry. Like she was a stripper. Like I kind of wish she had been part. Like how funny would it have been to see her in this like throughout the schemes and everything. Like she would have been so good. So that was like a little bit sad. Like looking back I was like, oh, I wish she was in more, but this just makes me want to see her in movies now, so which I'm sure she will be doing. But yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. Like why were they there? It was so quick.
Yes, 100% would have loved more Cardi B. Honestly, the reason that she wasn't there during the rest of the scheming, though, this I feel I do have a justification for, which is that character would have called bullshit on J-Lo bringing in drug addicts.
Oh, yeah.
She would have been loud.
Yeah. But then at that point, she could have left, right? Because that was like really far into it. So she could have just been like, bye, like, I'm leaving.
Oh, hell no.
But yes, I would have enjoyed more Cardi B in this movie for sure.
She was so funny.
We already talked a little bit about the found family component of this, and I think that's probably the big thematic element that we were bound to discuss at some point. But we've also been kind of talking around the crime the crimes that they were doing and how that played for us. I want to talk a little bit more about that. I appreciated the lengths that the movie went to remind us of, you know, the recession and like people who caused the recession not really suffering any consequences for it. And like that whole dynamic, I think was very smart and interesting as a way of setting up the idea that it was, you know, maybe okay to root for these women, even as what they're doing is bad. But I don't know. I'm curious how you guys felt about that, about the having these protagonists be like criminals.
I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't feel bad for the guys.
Okay, yes, same.
I started to feel bad when it was like the one guy with the glasses towards the end, because
Doug?
He wasn't, Doug, because you could tell he wasn't one of these guys who just like dehumanizes women.
And he has an autistic kid, and his mortgage.
Right, but they obviously did that like to like make you feel like bad for him or whatever. But like if somebody like that gets something, and it's hard because it's like you never want to say like someone deserves it. Like nobody ever deserves to be sort of taken advantage of. But at the same time, it was like they just took their money. It was like if they had done other stuff to them, like whatever, but they took their money and they deserved it. That's the hill I will die on.
J-Lo's line about the, you know, like that money is the firefighters' pension fund.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like,
and she's not wrong. That's the shit about it. Like, she's not wrong, especially during that time. Like, everybody was furious at the guys on Wall Street. And, like, they don't give a shit about these women or anybody else but themselves. Like, it's, like, a kind of archetype that they painted of these, like, very Wolf on Wall Street type of men. So I just find it very difficult to feel bad for them. Maybe that makes me a bad person. I accept it.
I mean, same. So,
like, by setting it in 2008, you have kind of like the reason and motivation for their crime, right? Nobody's making money, but it also immediately talk about 2008, and it is that kind of like, well, all of these people were like stealing money or making bad decisions, and a lot of them got away with it. And so I think that that's the other thing that the movie sets up, is that like plenty of people who were doing crimes on Wall Street like never get their comeuppance, I guess. And these women who were just, you know, trying to buy their fur coats and red bottoms, like they got caught, right? So I don't know, because it set it up that way too. I also was like, and the found family thing also comes into play here, because I think it kind of softens like the do crime if it's like do crime with your sisters. So I was kind of like rooting for, you know, the sisters to do crime together. And I did not feel bad for the men.
I also really loved how basically non-existent the men in this movie are. I appreciated that, just like as an experience, you know, to have in the theater, that even Cardi B's like non-appearance is still way more than any dude gets in this film. So that was really lovely just to have in the theater. I also thought, kind of to this point about setting it during the recession, and I don't know why I'm saying setting it happened.
It happened, yes.
Happened during the recession, this timing, all of that. But related to that, it's interesting how like buying into a lot of those ideas is ultimately part of what brought them down in the end. You know, like because they kept pushing to do more and like try to get more money and thus, you know, expand and bring more people in and you know, as Dorothy put it, you know, like I kept thinking that there would be a number, that there was just going to be a point where suddenly, you know, I would say, okay, this is it. I've now made enough that I don't need to do this anymore. But like that number never comes. That moment never happens. That to me is the actual tragedy in this story. Like it's not what happens to these dudes. Like fuck these dudes. Like the actual tragedy is the way in which they also end up buying into that mentality.
Yeah, I totally completely agree with that. The greed really was part of their downfall, like the ability to not stop or save money.
We're out here bringing up savings repeatedly. SnarkSquad pod telling you.
I was like sweating during the whole thing. But I mean, you know, also Dorothy brought up a really good point when Julia Stiles' character was interviewing her. She was asking her, like, did you grow up with money? Like, what would you do for $1,000? And then she's like, remember, it means like, it depends on what you need and like what you already have or something like that. And it's so true, because these people are people who don't come from money, and like to not come from money to getting like a penthouse apartment in New York City where you have like chinchilla furs and like red bottoms, like you would like lose your fucking mind. Like
Right.
that's so much. And like it's not like they're out there like finding financial consultants and stuff like that, you know. They're still in the world where it's just like them dancing or scheming or doing whatever they need to do to get by. And I just feel like the thought of like, okay, time to stop and be responsible now is like really hard when you're in the heat of the moment, because it's also like an adrenaline thing, right? And I feel like especially for like all the women, including Dorothy's character, had been dancing for a while, and these guys treated them like complete shit. So it was also like a revenge thing. Like one of the guys that they pulled the scheme on, and they don't mention it, but you just like sort of see him in like the montage of like guys who they fucked over, was the one who told her who told Dorothy he'd give her $300 if she just like touched him, and it ended up just being 320s. And she kept saying no like repeatedly. So it's just like, well, screw this guy, you know? And like, I feel like the combination of like money and revenge against like men who treated you terribly could be so addicting. I'm just assuming. I don't know personally. I'm saying that like I know from experience. Guys, I have a confession to make. No. So yeah, like I totally get that. Like I really do feel like it was an interesting sort of paradox to paint, that they sort of like fell victim to the very things that these guys that were their marks had also become this way because of that, because of money, you know? So
I think it's really interesting that we also see like a time, I forget when exactly, but that Ramona ends up working at like Old Navy or something like that. Like she tries to do retail, and how difficult it was for her too. And just like, even just her interaction with her manager, who was also not great. I'm like, yeah, you know what? It is really hard to work a 9 to 5. Go drug some men. I feel that. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
I think it's also like a lack of example too. Like, I mean, I grew up in the hood, and like for me growing up, like when you were in school, like the thought of like college wasn't really mentioned much in my schools, you know, which was very different when I moved to like the suburbs later on. It's like a big focus on that, especially I see that with my nieces and nephews. But like for me growing up, like our idols were like people on like rappers and like singers and the guys on the block who had like nice cars and nice shoes. And the way that they got those things was through like illegal activities. So it's almost like you don't have a frame of reference for like how to do better. Like, what do I do to like fix my life? You know, like this is what I grew up around, and like this is how I make it out, because I don't have any other skills, which is totally not true, because if they were essentially running a business, but those ideas get drilled into your head basically when you grow up not having much. So I get it.
And to reiterate something that you mentioned earlier, their social circle didn't change all of a sudden once they had this money too. Like they weren't suddenly surrounded by people who grew up wealthy or whatever, or who like had, I don't know, maintenance habits of wealth, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it. And so all of which to say, like, yes, it makes perfect sense. Before I actually saw this movie, I saw that there was some sort of controversy surrounding the portrayal of sex workers. And I looked into it after watching it, mostly because I was curious, you know, like it seemed like most of this talk was before the movie came out. And in my like, you know, brief Google searching, that kind of still seems to be the case, that there's a lot less pushback on what the movie actually is. But I understand the anxiety that one might feel about a movie about sex workers who do crimes. I think that the movie does a pretty good job of, one, even making the crimes that these women are doing super sympathetic. Obviously, all three of us feel that way. We've covered that base. But also, like, there is not the same degree of violence that I think I have seen in other portrayals of sex workers. Obviously, like, the movie does have to point out how garbage these men are. And so there are some elements of that. Obviously, that scene, you know, with Dorothy and the guy not paying her, and a lot of like racism and all of that is there. But I think the portrayal of their bodies never felt like violent. And it also this movie about strippers still felt super female gazy rather than male gazy in terms of the way that we were looking at their bodies. And I don't know. I'm, not necessarily the best person to speak to all of this, but I'm curious if you guys had any sort of thoughts and feelings about this.
So one thing that I really did appreciate is that there was no like big moment of like any of the women getting beaten or like raped or anything violent happening to them, which I feel like so often happens in movies about sex workers. I appreciated that sort of like lack of violence towards women, or like even one of them like not getting killed or whatever. Like that's such a low bar, but I feel like it happens so often. It's sort of like if a stripper is in sort of some like crime related movie, something bad's usually happening to them. Like they're the tragic figure, right? So I appreciated that. I read an article about like how a couple like about how sex workers were feeling about this movie, and it seems like it's like divided between some people just like being like really excited about it being like a fun movie, and then some people feeling like sex workers are treated so terribly in real life, but then like Hollywood is like allowed to like have fun and like glamorize it. So I can see I can see both sides of it, obviously. And having never been a sex worker myself, obviously I can't speak to how the movie would have made me feel as somebody in that community. But I will say that I do appreciate the fact that they all had their own agency and that there wasn't any sort of like really like violent moments towards any of the women. I think the men really were the only ones getting like anything happening to them. It was usually because they were falling because they were like doped up. So yeah, that's my like sort of general feel about it.
I think the agency is exactly what I was going to say. Like there was something these women I don't know, they were put in a tough situation because of the recession and like trying to make ends meet or whatnot. But there was something, this is going to sound weird because they were drugging people, but there was something almost empowering about the way that they approached, like, I don't know, we're down on our luck. We don't have many options, but they became business women in a sense. Again, I understand that it was crime. So like what I'm saying is that like the exercise of agency was present in such a way that I thought that it gave it a more positive spin than I've seen in other places that tackle sex work. And I think, again, the fact that found family was there as well, and the fact that they showed positive relationships between the women themselves. Like, even at the very beginning when Dorothy was, like, watching Ramona, I very much expected for it to be catty at some point, and it just never was. It was immediately like, sit in my fur, take you under my wing, like, let's do this, let's team up, come on into the business, let's eat Christmas dinner together. Like, there was obviously, like, friction there for when Ramona was making bad decisions, when Dorothy accepted the plea deal, but that felt like very like problems of friends who do crime together versus like the cattiness of women kind of thing. So I really appreciated that they kept that positive. And yes, I thought, obviously there was a little nudity and there was like, a lack of clothes in general, like just very like, few clothes or whatever, but it didn't feel gross to me. Not that nudity is gross, but it didn't feel like male gazy, as you said. Like it didn't feel like it was exploiting the actresses or exploiting the characters is what I mean to say. It was a really pretty movie to look at. Like even the color scheme and things like that was just cool. So I enjoyed that piece of it as well.
I also want to quickly shout out, agree, it was a very pretty movie to look at. Like aesthetically, this movie was fantastic. And in addition to all of the incredible performances, it was also incredibly well directed and well shot. And so yes, big +1.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really like a lot of the stylistic choices that the movie made in terms of like cinematography and like just the things that they did were really interesting and cool. And I think like took it like a step above like just like a fun movie and like made it like a little like something more.
There were pieces of it too that felt like super well choreographed, which I said that and I was like, wait, I'm not talking about like the pole choreography, which, I expected we would see a lot more. we don't like that is not at all like a focus of the movie at all. I think we get like one extended scene from J-Lo and a few like bumps and grinds, but they very quickly get off the pole and into the like actual like drugging of men and stuff. But it felt well choreographed in other ways. Like even when they're doing like the choreography of dumping the drugs into the drink and handing it to the men and like that kind of like montage, it just felt very, I don't know, like musical. It felt like a dance. It was very entertaining. And I think that also softens the fact that you're like watching men get drugged because you're like, ooh, pretty. Which is
the point, because that's what was happening to the men too. They weren't realizing
exactly.
To that point about the lack of like pole scenes, it is definitely a female gaze film. So even that bit with J-Lo, which is again probably the most that we get of that, and like we do see the, you know, the men throwing the dollar bills at her or whatever, but really the big takeaways in that scene are, one, how in her element J-Lo is. Like when the men are throwing dollar bills at her, we're not like trying to be in the heads of these men lusting after her. We're a little bit in her head as she's like, I'm a boss and I know it. And then we are also in Dorothy's head as she's looking at her going, she's a boss and she knows it and I want to be a boss like her, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that whole scene doesn't exist to say like, you know, look how hot this woman is turning these men on. It's like, look at what this experience is for these two women. And beyond that, most of the other scenes are Ramona teaching Dorothy, right? So like, again, those scenes are about them and there, you know, there are no men present even in those scenes, or, you know, when the men are present, you know, we're watching them have fun and like revel in what an easy mark each of these men is.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I really loved that scene. Like, on aside from, you know, the aforementioned criminal choreography, which I am a huge fan of, but just the way that, yeah, like Dorothy was looking at her with such awe and like admiration. And then J-Lo just like takes her like big handful, like armfuls of money and just like walks away like smiling. And I was like, I wanted to be J-Lo in high school, and I guess I still do, because this is amazing.
And on that note of wanting to be J-Lo, that brings us to the end of another episode of the podcast. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Clarabelle for joining us. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would love it if you consider joining our community on Patreon at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. We would love to hear all of your thoughts on Hustlers. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com, or you can find us all on Twitter at Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Martinez.
And I'm at Clarabelle_Ortega.
Thank you, as always, to Stephen Jin for the theme music that is playing us out right now, and we will be back in your feed again next week. Bye!
Bye.